Thank you all for joining us today at our Natalia Samutina lecture, which is held in memory of our friend and colleague, a talented scholar, lecturer, founder of the Research Center for Contemporary Culture at Poletayev Institute. Hopefully, it will become an annual event, visible and important national meeting point for the scholars engaging with contemporary culture. The passing of Natalia Samutina is something unimaginable for me. It is irreplaceable loss for all of us personally and professionally. Her lasting 4 years brave fight against cancer without any indulgence to professional drawbacks, without smallest personal inattention to her friends and colleagues, with a hasty move to online-based life for the last year, this makes me feel like a new Zoom window will suddenly appear and will hear profound questions and catching laughter by Natalia Vladimirovna. Her passing away is unimaginable, and this feeling is not something I want to fight against. Natalia Samutina is a bright scholar. She is an empathetic teacher. She is a brilliant organizer, even an architect of science. In the work of her friends and colleagues, her students in our Institute Center for Contemporary Culture, she stays with us. The French philosopher Gabriel Marcel wrote that to tell someone I love you is virtually the same as saying you shall never die. That's the Natalia Samutina Memorial Lecture we start today will be one of the forms we express our love to her. And I'm sincerely glad that the first Natalia Samutina Memorial Lecture is given by Ellen Rutten, Professor of Literature and Chair of the Department of Russian and Slavic Studies at the University of Amsterdam, good friend of Natalia Vladimirovna, good friend of our institute. But before the lecture, I now give floor to Boris Stepanov, who will say a couple words.
Thank you very much. I'll try to maybe make some introduction. So with Natalia, we knew each other for ages. We met each other in 1997 when we entered the Institute for the European Cultures, and that was the beginning of a beautiful friendship. At the beginning of the 2000s, we became a part of IGITI, being involved in projects on the images of the past, classics in the humanities, right up to our latest project on historical culture. Here in IGITI occurred things like Glinka as a cult cinema, Tsaritsina attractions with history groups, our groups on graffiti and street art and participatory cultures, and many other amazing stories. Many of you, I think, knew Natalia as an outstanding scholar, as a brilliant lecturer, inspiring head of research projects, and you knew our Center for the Study of Contemporary Cultures as an actively working division. But from my historical perspective, I would like to draw your attention to 2 or 3 points about Natalia and Natalia's biography and her work in the field of the cultural studies. First, she was a really self-made person. The starting points of her career weren't pretty advantageous. Graduated from the Polygraphic Institute, she could become an expert in cinema studies, which the field which is still underdeveloped in Russia. Having no experience of long-term work in Western universities, she became an internationally acknowledged scholar in the field of popular culture studies. Second, the creation of the Center for the Studies of Contemporary Culture in the Institute, which specialization is the sociology and history of knowledge is not an obvious situation. It took much time before the idea of such center was fulfilled. I think that, moreover, I think that creation of such center became possible due to Natalia's commitment to the spirit of the academic values, to the research spirit, and the wide cultural horizons, which were the feature of our which was always feature of the spirit of our institute. And the spirit make possible that, for example, people who interested in medieval philosophy and in modern cinema may well coexist, be interesting to each other. And I think that this was more, this academic values was more significant than the scholarly interests of the particular scholars. And the third things which seems significant to me is that besides this commitment to academic values, Natalia was a real poet of modern life in such a Baudelairean sense. She began her career with the study of auteur cinema, but then she turned to study of new areas that have no high status and cultural recognition. She was very sensitive to various imperfections, which will be the topics of Ellen's today's presentation. And I think that it's rather crucial for her research projects, and she showed the way for new generations of researchers. Thank you.
So now it seems that we are giving floor to Ellen Rutten. Please.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this invitation and for your two wonderful introduction, Alexei and Boris. So dear colleagues and dear students of Zhenya Varabyova, I saw there's a whole group of students even listening along. That's fantastic. I want to start this lecture with a few words in Russian. Also for those here for whom this meeting is important, but who may not speak English fluently. It's just very briefly, and I will switch to English afterwards for the full lecture. Дорогие все, прежде чем приступить к лекции, я хочу выразить благодарность организаторам лекции и также хочу поблагодарить, в частности, Борису Степанову, Алексею Плюшкову и Александре Колесник. И я также хочу поблагодарить Наталью Самутину, человека, которому эта лекция посвящена. Мысль о том, что Наталья не будет с нами ни сегодня, ни в будущем, тяжела не только для меня. И я думаю сказать, что мы с ней потеряли умную, добрую коллегу, это просто резко недостаточные слова. Произносить классический панигирик я не буду, потому что мне кажется, что такой жанр не очень подходит свободному духу и субтильно деловому стилю Наташи. Но я надеюсь, что вы мне позволите сказать ей пару слов. Наталья, 1, скучаем по тебе. 2, я надеюсь, что твой блистательный дух и ясный ум будут с нами хотя бы чуть-чуть, не только сегодня. 3, я специально надела тоже платье, как вы видите, как на этой фотографии. Мы ведь тогда и о моем, и о твоем наряде серьезно поговорили. И я знаю, что ты знаешь, насколько подобная деталь не тривиальна. 4, я буду, и я думаю, мы все будем думать о тебе в течение лекций и дискуссий. Спасибо за то, что ты была, и что ты все же и сейчас есть с нами. So this was the Russian. I'll switch back to English. A short version for those of you who do not speak Russian. I thank Natalia Samutina, to whom this lecture is dedicated, for having been with us and for her sparkling spirit and sharp mind. And I only realized in already sitting here that I didn't say the most important thing, which is that I think Boris put it so beautifully. Natalia really was and is a poet of modern life, for me, she was an absolute inspiration far beyond academic domains. And I know that's true for many of you here. So I want to thank Natalia for calmly and cheerfully taking a completely idiosyncratic, very refreshing route, not just in Russian academia, but in academia at large. We miss you, Natalia, and I think that we all think of you hard this afternoon. So it's very good to be able to do so together. For me, it's a real relief that we are sitting here for 2 full hours to do so. And I really thank the organizing for facilitating this series of events in Natalia's memory. Okay, I use my lecture to share recent research related to 2 projects on which I've worked and am working at the University of Amsterdam between 2015 and today. And the projects are titled 1, Sublime Imperfections, and 2, Protest Appeals. For both projects, I cooperated closely with Natalia, so I picked them with a reason. In part 1 of my talk, I turned to the first project, and at that part, I use historical analysis to ponder a question that I studied in detail in recent years, and that's the question, why do imperfections, I think Boris just said they attracted Natalia, but they attract people, why? In part 2, there's a much shorter part 2, but a very important one for the discussion. I lift a tip of the veil of new and for me still very confusing research devoted to the question, why do protests appeal to people? And which sounds, images and words do protesters across Eastern Europe use to mobilize public support? So as said, the second part of the lecture is much shorter, much opener, but in that concluding part, I really hope to lean on the expertise of some here and on Natalia and her colleagues in particular. So it would be wonderful if through your input we can boost the Samutina level of this upcoming project. So for part 1 on the history of imperfection, aesthetics and rhetoric, I start with a small journey back in time through 3 citations. And I read the original in Russian, my slides offer translations. Citation 1. In the 2010s, variations on the anonymous motivational poem «Я совершенное несовершенство», I am the perfect imperfection, circulated actively on Russian dating sites, amateur poetry sites, and other social media. The poem's heroine presents herself in oxymoronic terms, as you see in this citation. «Я смесь из крика и улыбки, из правильных решений и ошибки, из боли и блаженства, я совершенное несовершенство». So to visualize this message, some web users add part blurred or grayscale visuals. The photos on this slide, which users Ksenia Taina and Gertana added on amateur poetry and diary sites to reprints of the poem, are 2 mere examples. In June 2020, I searched for the poem and then it yielded over 14,000 search hits and multiple granular photos and drawings of young women. That's citation 1. Citation 2. In 1927, literary theorist Viktor Shklovsky wrote about montage and the possibilities of the new medium of cinema. Конечно, надо усовершенствовать аппарат, но работа художника состоит и в художественном использовании технических затруднений. Поэзия основана на несовершенстве человеческой речи. Citation 3 is so well known. I was going to say that I first want to see if someone recognizes it, but I think I accidentally already put the name and the face of the writer in the slide. Otherwise, you would have guessed it probably. So I'll read the original and you can read along in English. Ihr Spiel, ihr Singen hat den unangenehm richtigen geistlosen Takt der singenden Maschine. Uns ist diese Olympia ganz unheimlich geworden. Es war uns, als tue sie nur so wie ein lebendiges Wesen. In 1816, romantic writer and composer E.T.A. Hoffmann famously placed an automaton, a self-operating machine, at the heart of a love story. In Der Sandmann, a student meets a picture-perfect girl and falls for her. The story ends darkly. The student discovers that he has fallen for a machine masked as human. He loses his mind and dies. Now, these citations, to which I return later, are central to this first part of my talk, in which I look at a topic for whose analysis I visited Natalia's team more than once in the past 5 years. And I'm speaking of the nexus between technology and imperfection, which 2 PhD students and I have studied in the context of this research project, which you see here, at the University of Amsterdam the past years. And I want in this longer first part of the lecture to do three things. First, explain why I think that when we talk about technological transition, we need to talk about the perfect and imperfect and about dreams of imperfection. I use that phrase for claims that imperfection is good or productive. So dreams of imperfection triggered by technological progress. Next, I outline which types of dreams of imperfection we witness today. And in this part, I ask, which positive promises do contemporary media users and producers in Russia and elsewhere project onto the non-perfected? And in part 3, I ask, how can older stories help us to understand the contemporary preoccupation with imperfection? And in answering that question, I examine 2 historical periods in which cultural producers and consumers faced drastic technological transitions. The first is Romanticism, and the second, the early 20th century. So as you will see from the story, 3 rhetorical strategies emerge that resonate particularly vividly in debates about technology and imperfection, and which strategies those are, why they merit our attention. Those questions I save until the end. So first 3 methodological remarks about the project before we start. I think actually the first one missed in earlier lectures for Natalia's team, and Natalia would have been glad to see that I finally inserted this slide, proper slide about definitions. So 1, what ranks as imperfect in one time and place, for instance, a curvy female body on a Paris catwalk today, might be seen as a pinnacle of attraction or health in another, the same body in, say, Stalin-era Russia, or on a Rubens painting. So to make matters worse, the word imperfection has an odor of defeatism and capitulation. I'm citing cultural critic Clyde Taylor, who says imperfection can be a strategy of cultural resistance, but it also evokes stigma. So with this semantic elusiveness in mind, historians Stephen King and Stephen Taylor advise against, and I cite them, using an imperfect-perfect dichotomy as an analytical prism. Rather than a fixed entity, they write, and I cite them again, the concept of imperfection and its construction has been an ever-present historical narrative in the broadly defined modern period. So what we do in our research project is talk precisely about this historical narrative about the concept of imperfection. And we're not interested in imperfection or its Russian equivalent nesovershenstvo as a fixed or unproblematic term. So we try to look at it as a historical narrative. 2, my research is indebted to critical discourse analysis, and I cite linguist Norman Fairclough, systematic transdisciplinary analysis of relations between discourse and other elements of the social process. This means that what we look at in this research is the way users employ or have employed the concept of imperfection. We do so by looking at relevant texts, including social media posts, prose, political manifestos, PR slogans, so different types of text. 3, last methodological remark, rather than local, disciplinary and historical specificities, our team examines analogies and patterns across social domains, times and spaces. And we know that also makes the research vulnerable, but we agree with these scholars that such a broad comparative approach is a burden, but also a great opportunity for cultural historians. Okay, so those were some methodological remarks in advance. So part 1, section 1. Experts frame our age as mediated, digitized, or even post-digital. And to that age, perfection matters in multiple ways. As these images illustrate, tech producers strive by definition to perfect lives with continually perfected new products. Perfectionism also thrives among technology users, and that development is not unproblematic. This study suggests that social media users use precious young adults to perfect themselves in comparison to others, which makes them dissatisfied with their bodies and increases social isolation. The social media urge to perfect has even sparked public concern about such prettily named new diseases as Snapchat dysmorphia. Maybe some of you know this condition. So patients with this condition want to resemble their filtered selfies so badly that they turn to plastic surgery, or so theorists of Snapchat dysmorphia say. Now, I'm wary of the cultural pessimistic tone that analysis like these sometimes adopt. And I think this is something where Natalia and I really found each other. I've never caught Natalia thinking in a cultural pessimistic way. But these studies do illustrate the cult of perfectionism that reigns among tech companies, and also the broader politics of perfection of technological progress. And these are two sources that expand on those trends. That was part one. Part two, so the politics of technology-driven perfection, this dynamics that I was just trying to show you, it also generates counter responses. The motivational poem with which I started my lecture is a good example. As we saw, Russian social media users Ksenia Taina and Gertana used photos of pensively looking young girls as illustrations for the anonymous poem, I Am the Perfect Imperfection. Oh yeah, here they are. The poem and the grainy quasi-vintage looks of the photos convey a consistent message. Pain and flaws are a vital part of everyday lives and of the ways in which we present those lives on digital platforms. And Ksenia Taina and Gertana are not alone in sharing that message this way. Many Russophone social media users reproduce the same poem online, as I said earlier, and many pair it, here's another example, to female imagery, from videos of women whose looks defy traditional beauty standards to photos of polished krasavitsi in erotic poses. And here is an example of that last type. Now, this counter response is itself not problem-free, of course. At first sight, the poem offers an inclusive counter message to the polished looks for which some media users strive. Remember the Snapchat dysmorphia patients. But on closer inspection on these and other accompanying photos, media users who share the poem show us young, slender, as a rule, white, able-bodied, good-looking beauties shot in attractive semi-erotic poses. So what the visuals tell viewers is imperfection is good as long as it looks unequivocally attractive, cute, and sexy. Feminist studies like these helpfully unpack these and other paradoxes of cultural representations of beauty and diversity. At the same time, and I think this is an important point to make, and also something where I've had to learn from Natalia and her team, it would be incorrect to sort of reduce Ksenia Taina's and Gertana's post to wrong approaches to imperfection, or to say they are not doing it the right way. These and other fans, I'm showing them again, these and other fans of the Perfect Imperfection poem do invite reflection on normative thinking and on the important question, what does it mean in this digitized age to present oneself and one's life as perfect? So in asking this question, Ksenia Taina and others follow a broader, emphatically transnational, transdisciplinary trend, and this is the trend at which I want to halt briefly before returning to my historical sources. And this is the present day trend. Oh, don't look at the picture yet. I'll say a bit about that. Just look at the words, dreams of imperfection. This is the present day trend to valorize imperfection, or to present the imperfect as asset rather than a problem. And I share 7 examples of this trend to give you an idea of what I mean when I say that. For the first, I inserted this little picture of a previous publication of mine. As I argued elsewhere, in the 2000s, several Russian writers and journalists praised blogging services as outlets for playful, imperfect writing, and, as one typo fan of the time wrote, a prioritet искренности над грамотностью. You can again read along with the English on the slide. And in the anti-literacy manifesto of so-called подонки, the бездушной правильности and совершенства of online spellcheckers made place for outright willful misspellings. 2, in composing this virtual reality opera, 8, Dutch composer Michel van der Aa noticed that its virtual characters initially had an uncanny valley, unrealistic feel. And he said in an interview, I solved that problem by, I'm citing him, deciding to show the digital imperfections and glitches. 3, in this essay, art theoretician Boris Groys witnesses an eroticism of imperfection in Ukrainian photographer Boris Mikhailov's photos of Soviet-era daily life and of homeless people in post-Soviet Kharkiv in Ukraine. 4. No, where am I? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3. Sorry, I misnumbered. 4. For Australian photographer Alex Kearns, the disabilities of impaired animals are perfect imperfections which make them unique. 5, in his collection Beautiful Imperfection, Ghanese designer Steve French, so from Ghana, explores the nexus between mental illness and creative expression. 6, this best-selling American self-help book tells readers, in our mediatized age, we can only lead wholesome lives by accepting our imperfections and shortcomings. And finally, 7, British supermarket Tesco produces perfectly imperfect pears to reduce waste. Now, these are tips of an iceberg of positive present-day dreams of valorizations of imperfection, dreams that our team studies together with other experts in anthropology, marketing, and noise studies, among other fields, in this upcoming edited volume. And I'm excited to share this here because we literally, the cover might look a bit different. We literally are convening about cover images as we speak. So this will appear soon. The dreams of imperfection that we examined stem, as you saw, from various world regions, social domains, genres, and they boast various language pragmatics. Of course, a Tesco ad works differently than an art theoretical text, but they share important things too. 1, all focus on that which is not perfect, the state, and I cite a dictionary definition of being without fault or defect, corresponding to an ideal standard, or pure, lacking in no detail. In my examples, this flawless state is exchanged for a logic of norm deviation, incompletion, or decay. 2, in each example, the non-perfected is praised as a hallmark for something good. Beauty, for instance, social inclusion, authenticity, or mental well-being. In some practices, the dichotomy perfect-imperfect flip-flops altogether, as when Kearns speaks of perfectly imperfect animals. And 3, each example responds to social transitions, ecological or economic crisis, but also, perhaps most predominantly, mediatization and technological shifts. Their makers and users embrace the imperfect in an attempt to cope with a reality in flux. Now, we already saw that some aspects of imperfection fandom understandably raise eyebrows, and there are more problems with this rhetoric and aesthetics. I already looked at the critique that people say, so how open to the non-perfect are posts like those by Xenia Taina really? Other critics ask, so aren't they consolidating rather than defying beauty norms? Other critics ask, aren't imperfection advocates always haves rather than have-nots? For the images of homeless Russians that Greuze calls erotically imperfect, buyers pay thousands of euros. And in idealizing counter norms, aren't advocates of imperfection downplaying real life problems? So Kearns's cute animal photos bypass the chronic pain that impairments can entail. So there are problems with this rhetoric and with this aesthetics. At the same time, pleas for imperfection are no mere fun for the privileged. Some play helpful roles in diminishing excessive consumerism, enhancing social inclusion, and other productive social interventions. So I think it is very important that we take them seriously. Okay, part 3 of the first part of my talk. Today I explore neither the contemporary interest in imperfection as such, nor its pluses and minuses. Instead, I turn to its historical lineage and to the question, how can older stories help us to unpack current pleas for imperfection and pleas against technological perfection in particular? And to answer this question, we could examine many historical cases. Scholars observe, for instance, an art of imperfection in traditional synagogue building. Synagogue architects traditionally design irregularities to remind visitors of the imperfection of creation or the promised land Israel. Or other scholars distinguish an aesthetics of imperfection in ancient Japanese tea ceremonies, where tea masters idolized worn bowls to criticize their patrons' wealth. Now, these 2 examples are mere examples from a long list of historical traditions that positively value the non-perfected. From that long list, I selected 2 periods that witness a particularly persistent, discipline-transcending interest in imperfection, and that is the Romantic era and the early 20th century. In both periods, pleas for imperfection were born not primarily from economic or religious deliberations, as this tea-bowl and synagogue design are, but in response to technological transitions. And I start with Romanticism. I already showed you this slide for a second earlier, and I want to look at it a bit longer now. So I start with a citation. Perfection had been found wanting. It was now the time to turn toward imperfection, toward approximation as the most desirable modes of dealing with informational processing. With these words, cultural historian Virgil Nemoianu typifies a triumph of imperfection, as he calls it, in European Romanticism between 1815 and 1848. What he says is the Romantic era was an age of globalization, urbanization, social mobility, and it confronted higher educated citizens with an avalanche of informational data. The attempt of the citizens to deal with those changes, to digest the psychological and philosophical implications of the changes, Nemoianu frames in near-medicinal terms as reconciliations with a new frightful social state. Now, among the strategies that contemporaries use to negotiate socio-technological transition, Nemoianu singles out that of embracing imperfection, as he calls it. That is, of foregrounding doubts and paradoxes rather than fixed truths and certainties. And he recognizes this strategy in the Romantic popularization of science, in a preference for crossing disciplinary artistic boundaries, and in an exchange of broader desires of perfection for coziness and intimacy. So, to summarize, Nemoianu neatly documents this romantic move away, as he calls it, from rigid perfection. What interests me in that move is its manifestation in one concrete discursive trend, and that is the trend to berate new technologies for correctness and to frame the imperfect as an antidote for their flawlessness. A second look at Hoffmann helps us to understand how this trend works. Der Sandmann is a world-famous tale about technology and threat. The story, and it's, we could of course talk about this story. It has many interesting parallels with contemporary love stories with AI devices, but I leave that for what it is. I do want to reflect on the words with which Hoffmann typifies the automaton. When you look at his descriptions of Olympia, and this is just one example of many, two lexical clusters intertwine. The first we could call a flawlessness cluster. This cluster revolves around nouns, adjectives, and adverbs that underscore the spotlessness, stiffness, regularity, correctness of Olympia's looks and acts. And the second could be called a death cluster. This darker cluster underlines the automaton's unpleasantness, coldness, soullessness, and lifelessness. So as this overview illustrates, and as others have shown before me, in Hoffmann's world, the machinic is the exact, perfect but dead opposite of an imperfect but soulful humanness. Now that's a very classic dynamic, and I'm not interested in that dynamics in itself, but I'm interested in the social dreams and fears about technological progress that it reveals. And to unpack those, it helps to compare Hoffmann's story with this influential art theoretical text from the 1850s, when this information deluge blended with concerns about industrialization and failed revolutions. In his Stones of Venice treatise, British art historian John Ruskin combines praise for Gothic aesthetics with critique on machine-driven faultlessness. He applauds Gothic artists for managing to craft an unaccusable whole out of fragments of imperfection. And he sees in their work a counterdote to the perfect polishings that rule industrialized Britain. After all, imperfection, he famously argues, is in some sort essential to all that we know of life. Nothing that lives is rigidly perfect. In all things that live, there are, so I'm giving a longer citation from his work, in all things that live, there are certain irregularities and deficiencies, which are not only signs of life, but sources of beauty. To banish imperfection is to destroy expression, to paralyze vitality. Now, Ruskin was wary of simply romanticizing the non-polished, but here and elsewhere he does make very clear where his sympathy lies. we see another example of this very strict dichotomous rhetoric, where machine-driven perfection equals a lexical cluster revolving around destruction, failure, death, oppression, and overall wretchedness, and where the imperfect stands for all things beautiful, whole, alive, and progressive. Now, whether de Zandman influenced Stones of Venice, I don't know, I'm not certain. I haven't been able to establish the links between the two properly yet, but Ruskin's and Hofmann's rhetoric of imperfection boasts clear parallels. In both, technology equals dead perfection, and imperfection is a source of life and aesthetic joy. So we move to a more recent historical period, and the last historical period that I want to look at, that's the early 20th century. If in the Romantic era, a technology-induced logic of imperfection triumphed, that conclusion prompts the question, what happened once this triumph of imperfection materialized? How, more pointedly, did creative professionals think and talk about technology and perfection or imperfection after Romanticism? To answer these questions, it helps to look at this study by music historian Ted Gioia. What Gioia does in this book is he criticizes a tradition to frame early and mid-20th century jazz art as art that is charming despite or even thanks to its technical imprecision. He theorizes jazz music instead as an aesthetics of imperfection, one that consciously prefers the haphazard and defies aesthetic standards which seek perfection in art. This imperfect art of jazz, he says, returns to art an ethos of individualism and the human elements. Now, in conceptualizing jazz as imperfect art, Gioia paints a helpful, broader picture of the early 20th century. So in his book, you can read more about the broader context in which this is taking place. And what he says is that in that broader contextualization, that the early 20th century was a time of new music and new music and recording technologies, and of growing pleas for seamless music and dehumanizing approaches to composition. Now, those of you who sort of listened carefully to the types of words that are being used already saw that Gioia is clearly drawing a parallel between jazz and Romanticism. He even refers to Ruskin at one point explicitly. In his words, the insistence in jazz on improvisation, individualism, and anti-institutionalism emblematizes an aesthetic sensibility, essentially romanticist in character. So it's an explicit link that he makes with Romanticism. What Gioia does not mention, and what I do want to highlight here, is another sensibility that the Jazz Age and the Romantic Age share. In both periods, technological advancement and pleas against perfection not merely co-occurred, but actively intersected. In the early 20th century, across Europe and the United States, musical and photo, film, and print technologies became available to broad audiences. And in response, a transdisciplinary interest in imperfection then resonated across a much broader range of disciplines than Gioia acknowledges in this book. And technological transitions mattered to this imperfection cult much more than he implies. It transpires, for instance, in Walter Benjamin's famous writings. I'll keep it very short, oversighted, but indeed still very inspiring writings about about mechanical reproduction, aura, and the extent to which, I cite him, the sphere of authenticity resides outside technical reproducibility. In Benjamin's words, even perfect reproductions miss the presence of original artworks. We see the same trend in late Imperial Russian discourses of sonic fidelity, triggered by the rise of a mechanized record industry. Historian Anna Fishson has demonstrated that listeners worried that recorded music lacked pathos. In response, on the one hand, producers then tried to recreate authentic sounds on record with hyper-polished recordings. And on the other, such thinkers as Theodor Adorno argued, as rephrased by Fishson, that it was the residue of incidental noises and other imperfections that make the recording sound human. So again, a link is forged between humanness and imperfection. So where Benjamin sought authenticity outside the technical, in short, Adorno found it in flaws inside new technologies. A technology-induced preoccupation with imperfection also resonates in the Shklovsky citation that I shared. Shklovsky famously framed poetry as a technique of roughening language, and he viewed that as an important artistic strategy in times of technological shifts. His argument, more or less, is artists should welcome technological innovation and embrace its challenges, and it is from this play with technological challenge that a true imperfection-based poetry emerges. So that's Shklovsky's take on art and technology in short. A last example that I merely briefly mention here with some images of avant-garde female artists, because to date this historical overview has been quite male, so this is also for some gender balance. So a last example that I simply only mention briefly is what Boris calls a formal and conceptual dialectics of imperfection in the works of Russian avant-garde artists, triggered by technological advancement. And what I want to show you in the category, oh, here they are. This is the overview of all of them together. In the category non-trivial parallels, I inserted this extra slide to point to a remarkable resemblance between Rozanova and Samutina. So this picture was already in my presentation from an earlier paper, but then I discovered this interesting visual parallel with Natalia. So here's a bit of Natalia before we move to my conclusion. So to summarize, and I'll let Natalia linger for a moment while I summarize, in the early 20th century, technological advancement did not simply run parallel to an interest in the imperfect, as Joya suggests. Critics, consumers of recording technologies, artists, theoreticians, they connected the two in much more fundamental ways. For some, irregularity or noise safeguarded an authenticity or originality that shunned representational perfection in the face of technological change. And others said artists should welcome the flaws that come with new technological toolkits. So I conclude with the question with which I started this first longer part of my talk. How can older stories help us understand contemporary pleas for the non-perfected? In order to answer that question, what I did was compare first two canonical romantic texts. Hoffmann merely diagnoses technology as dangerously perfectionist. Ruskin offers imperfection as alternative to dead machine-driven perfection, but both see technological flawlessness as a threat. The early 20th century features less pessimistic voices. Adorno, for instance, projects humanness onto acoustic blemishes. Benjamin opposes artistic authenticity to perfect reproductions, and avant-garde artists and theoreticians practiced what Groys calls a dialectics of imperfection in film and other new media and technologies. Now, when we return to the here and now, we see that some historical strategies recur. The Padonki revive romantic tropes when they equal computer correctness to soullessness and death. Other present-day imperfection advocates, as we saw, are close to Shklovsky and claim that social media enhance unpolished but sincere communication. And media users like Ksenia Taina and Gertana instrumentalize a rhetoric of perfect imperfections in response to polished online self-presentations. So together, these recent and older voices highlight the close relationship between, and I cite William Boddy, one of the studies on this slide, a close relationship between technological change and cultural form. Boddy and other media historians, which I show simply some out of a longer list of studies here, demonstrate that technological shifts inevitably actuate collective dreams, fantasies, and fears. They teach us that when cultural producers and consumers face new communication technologies, they rethink existential values, especially those values which, in their eyes, technological acceleration puts at stake. So humanness is one such value, authenticity another. These and my other examples demonstrate that perfection and imperfection play a central role in this process. Technological transitions trigger dreams about perfecting life and art, phobias, so fears for the downsides of these dreams, and debates about expression, realness, authenticity, and vitality. And when we try to juxtapose the voices that I was just comparing, I think that we can distill three recurring rhetorical strategies. The first, perfection pessimism. Perfection pessimists see new technologies as dangerously fault-free. They call for moving away from technology-induced dead perfection. 2, love for mistakes in the machine. Advocates of this strategy welcome technological advancement, but see mistakes in the machine or errors by its users as safeguards of humanness, vitality, or authenticity. And 3, imperfection activism. Imperfection activists do not just welcome machinic bugs or glitches as given, they actively make and toy with mistakes. They hack new technologies or otherwise defy perfection. So just as all taxonomies, this one should be handled with care. Hoffman is a clean-cut perfection pessimist. Adorno welcomes mistakes in the machine. Padonki actively produce imperfections in their writing, but other examples subject themselves to categorization less easily. Nevertheless, I hope that this preliminary taxonomy can help us in unraveling the stories that we tell ourselves about technological acceleration. And it can contribute to, I hope and I think, to the important task of boosting resilience against technology anxieties and pessimism. As we saw, technological pessimists have long feared technology-induced perfection and responded with invented traditions of authentic human imperfection. But of course, in truth, both new technologies and their human users brim and always will brim with flaws and glitches. And I think that unpacking and historically contextualizing technology anxieties helps in accepting that sobering insight. And I know that even though Natasha and I would always have vivid discussions about my methodologies and conclusions, she might take issues with some of them, but I know that she would agree. She would nod here and she would agree with this one on how both technologies and their users brim with flaws and glitches. Okay, as I said, I want to conclude with, this is really a 3-minute, I think, epilogue or coda with a few words on, while I introduce it, I'll have Natalia on the screen again with new research that I'm devising. And in that brief epilogue, I merely lift the tip of the veil of this new research. That research is so fresh that I'm actually hesitant to say much about it at this stage, but I do want to briefly mention it here, also because I'm keen on harvesting critical feedback and advice. As I said earlier, Natalia was on my list of proposed active network partners for this project. So any input that we can collectively share here, I also see as mild repair work for her absence in this project's future. The preliminary title of my new research project is Protest Appeals, the Effect and Aesthetics of Eastern European Activism. And this is its webpage on the site of the Dutch National Research Agenda. For this project, the plan is that scholars from our university team up with researchers and curators from 2 leading Dutch art museums, and that's the Stedelijk Museum and the Van Abbe Museum, and with artists and activists from the Netherlands and Eastern Europe, Russia included. With this project, we follow scholars who say to truly understand protest dynamics, we should read protests and demonstrations not through an exclusively political lens, as is today still often done in mainstream news reporting. I know that this is self-evident for some of you, but it's still the dominant lens in mainstream media. But we should also pay close attention to their emotional and aesthetic dynamics, because protests only work once they appeal to broad audiences. So to truly understand their social affectivity, we need to look beyond their literal political agenda towards things that I try to visually highlight with the 3 images on this slide. And that is the visual politics of protesters, their use of humor, their creative takes on gender, and their innovative use of media technologies. And it may be good to add that the top and middle images on this slide were shared actively on Facebook, Twitter, and on other social media. Now, with that eye for protest aesthetics and affects in mind, in Protest Appeals, we turn to protest practices across Eastern Europe and Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine in particular. Central to our research will be the question, how do protesters generate public esteem for actions, and which protest words, images, and sounds do they use to mobilize key political and media actors? In studying that question, we compare protest objects, posters, photos, fashion items, poems, songs, GIFs, memes from, well, GIFs, memes, are only applicable to one of the two periods, but from the rich historical Eastern European art collections of the Stedelijk and the Van Abbe museums to contemporary protest objects dating from the 2010s and early 2020s. Now, the question with which I would like to end, and which I really want to ask this audience, and that I'm sure Natalia would have had brilliant thoughts about, so I really miss her expertise here, is that of scholarly innovation. In comparing and historically contextualizing protest cultures as outlined here, protest appeals will lean on two existing scholarly subfields. Wait, let me see, did I do this? Yeah, these and other Eastern European protest cultures and transnational theorizing of protest aesthetics. In the grant proposal that I'm expanding for this project, I explained that so to conjoin the rich transnational theorizing of protest aesthetics, research field 2, with the related, but to date relatively modestly transnationally visible field, research field 2, of studies of cultural protest forms across Eastern Europe. Now, so far, our point about innovation that we make is these last studies have, or these studies of Eastern European protest cultures have much potential to nuance existing thinking about the aesthetics and effects of protest and, say, self-irony, gender stereotyping, and technological affordances. And I think one example of how that nuancing can work is that of existing thinking about digital feminist protest cultures. I think that scholarly subfield is bound to gain subtlety by Lisa Gaufman's recent studies of the visual iconography of the Belarusian protests. There's a small link to her work here. Maybe can I show it to you? Yeah, with the arrow here. So in the Belarusian protests of this year and last year, hypermasculine state representatives face near exclusively female-led protests. And I think in integrating her findings with transnational theorizing of protest cultures, that would be a really interesting synergy. In turn, a more systematic integration of studies of transnational theorizing into thinking about Eastern European protest cultures can help in complicating cleanly binary pictures of the regime as diametric opposites of historical avant-gardes, activist vloggers, and other cultural pioneers that some of these studies are well beyond already, but that still do dominate some studies in the field. So in short, what I want to argue in developing this plan is we need a firmer integration of these two research fields. And I really think that that integration matters for the project of deprovincializing scholarship of protest aesthetics and by thickening it with work from under-theorized localities. But that's the clean story. So what I want to end with is a question to you, and that's the question, how do I make maximally concrete how those two fields, not just that they can enrich each other, but how they can enrich each other? So which subtleties will a firmer integration of Eastern European protest studies bring the field of protest studies at large? This is a question that I'd love to, of course, you can also ask questions about the first project, but that I'd really love to talk about together. And I'm sure that were Natalia here today, she would have had many possible answers to this question. She also would have been able to pose many confusingly difficult questions. I would always leave half happy, half depressed after our sessions because I thought, oh, I just can't even answer those questions. So she would have had fantastic questions about the project. And what I know, one concrete thing that I know is she really would have loved also in this discussion to talk about graffiti art and the role that it could play in a project like this, because that is what she told me in our last email conversation. So in lieu of input from Natasha herself, I very warmly welcome any comments or questions that you may have, and that ideally help not just in strengthening this project, but also in, I guess, Natashifying it. So this would be my, I really hope that this will be something that you'll be doing in this lecture series too, to Natashify our future research. Thank you very much.
So we can right now just ask questions or give some comments on what Ellen told us.
Well, first of all, Ellen, thank you so much for your very inspiring talk. I hope we'll have, I hope we'll try to have like hot discussion anyway. And thank you for your extremely touching, sincere, and just authentic and wonderful words you said about the hero of today's event, which I don't know personally, but I feel like I'm getting to know her through your comments. So first of all, just a quick comment and then a question. So my quick comment is, I just looked, I usually, whenever anything comes up, I go to Wikipedia, right? Because often it's more comprehensive. So what I found Wikipedia is that, so glitch was already used, in the 1920s, when as soon as the radio came out. And technically, there's a difference between glitch and a bug. So bug is like some problem in the code, and it takes a while to find it. Whereas glitch is when technology does something, but it corrects itself, right? So like you have a radio and suddenly boom, right? So I think what's interesting, right, is the technical definition of a glitch used for like 100 years. It just system corrects itself. But in a cultural and artistic appropriation of this term, right, people kind of right, made it bigger into some kind of horrible era of the system. And this kind of sets up a platform for my question. And sorry, it will be a bit like, it will start with narrative, but it'll be very quick. So I remember when I came from Soviet Union, right, to the West in 1981, I was shocked by how well things work. At least in the 80s, even America worked, right? Not so much today. Even in the 90s, especially 2000s, I started to see how these terms glitch art and this obsession of errors and imperfection started to become stronger and stronger, right? In a kind of Western and soon global humanities and art. And I never had any interest in this, right? And I was very shocked why everybody is so interested in this. In my interpretation, I'm coming from a communist society, which is similar to often how Russia is today. Nothing worked, right? I mean, products were kind of bad, and everybody wanted to buy foreign products, which were better. And I thought, oh my God, I'm so happy when something works, right? So I love to live like now. I'm living in South Korea, which works much better. Than America. Right? America doesn't work anymore. So what I want to say, like, I want to propose an idea which is so simple, but it's obvious. But I'm sure you have something to say. I mean, I think the obsession, right, with glitch, imperfection, and so on in contemporary culture versus romanticism in the 19th century, and you were wonderful in showing historical continuity. But I think obsession of imperfection, glitch, error, and so on in contemporary culture, right, is a logical consequence of people of like Western or global culture, humanities and arts, basic idea that we live in capitalism. It's a system. The system works too well. We have to resist it. And therefore, we're looking or provoking or creating glitches, errors, and so on. Right? But if you step outside of this global but still very provincial assumption, then suddenly this obsession of glitch, error, and so on becomes kind of irrelevant, right? Because in fact, what I want to do, like, I don't want to destroy capitalism. I want to have capitalism which would work better, right? It will be more, equal, right? In fact, this idea, you'll see it in social science, but you'll never see this idea in humanities and arts, right? So everybody is on the left, and everybody is so much on the left, we don't even see it. So anyway, sorry, I probably spoke too much, but
no, thank you so much.
I hope you like the Russian connection. I
do.
Question, right? And because I think in this case, the Russian background actually makes, I think right, shines a certain interesting light on this question.
Yeah, okay. It does. Yeah. And it's interesting that you say this, because I think both at one of the meetings that Natalia organized and also at a lecture that I gave about this topic in the US at Stanford, we had Russian guests in the audience who said, well, wait, this works differently if, across different countries. So on the one hand, I don't think so what I really like doing in this project is drawing parallels, looking at patterns, which is why I don't say so much about the differences. But at the same time, and of course, I hope that in our edited volume, we don't even talk about it that much too, but I'm working on a monograph in the topic where I hope to say more about these types of differences. Of course, this works differently in different world localities. And I think an important source for me in thinking about some of the things that you mentioned, the idea that, how did you say it? When you are in a context where nothing works, it's much less logical to actually romanticize or glorify imperfections.
In fact, what you romanticize is the system which works. I'm also thinking about Africa, right, which is all based on people like repairing things, repairing broken Western technology, or Cuba, whereas like in the West, nobody knows how to repair stuff, right? People just throw stuff away. And think about Russia,
I think
where
for
the
me,
same thing would go for generations. Sorry.
No, I think for me, for now, and I'm still thinking about this question as I'm finalizing the monograph, but the answer would be that it works differently, but for some social groups, it does work the same way. On the one hand, I think what you were saying is also something that Andreas Schönle says in a very beautiful study of ruins, where he says, well, in the Russian context, ruin Freude works differently because in the Soviet era, for instance, with social deficits, economic deficits, there were less, what is the English word? I'm trying to think of the German word, but there was less reason to glorify decay and ruins. On the one hand. On the other hand, what is interesting is that, for instance, in let's say the time that Prigov started his performances, Moscow conceptualism, that it started, you do see many artistic projects, both in literary writing, music, visual arts, where theoreticians, artists do glorify these very wonky, rickety forms as a sort of token of integrity, but then it fulfills a different function. It's seen maybe more as this checkbox which says you are on the right side, you're not with the regime. And this is a very different dynamics, where I think that the fact that it's not unlinked to what Groys is saying about the eroticism of imperfection, where the regime was really promoting this culture of new, Novые люди, this very polished new Soviet culture. And then if you were, sorry, I'm also going to try not to talk so long so that we can have more questions, but if you were displaying this counterculture, which had this very clear aesthetics of imperfection, you were self-fashioning as somebody who was not with or in that culture. So it has a different function, but that's just a short answer, and I'm still scratching surfaces myself here. And of course, Africa is also another story. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Rita.
Yeah. Well, first, huge thanks for the amazing talk, and so good to see you and everybody. Actually, a lot of friends and colleagues are in the room, so it's a very good feeling of being together in our very disintegrated academia. So thank you all. And I have two questions. First, so I will just ask both, and then like you choose if it's even relevant to you. Like first, as you know, I find the theory of imperfection very inspiring, and as a framework, I try to use that. And so that's a question of like empirical application, because I'm an empirical sociologist of culture. So if we deal with imperfections regarding different, well, how you call it, art or cultural worlds, fields, areas, because like we know that Natasha, for instance, was huge fan of opera and classical music, and also like brilliant researcher of graffiti and manga culture. So do you think that we should have like one framework for all of these words regarding imperfection? Because obviously for something we still call high culture or high art, perfection is a very important signifier. But for the new cultures like TikTok, for instance, like because if you film or create a TikTok content, usually just like, do you think that imperfection or perfection would be relevant here, and how should we deal with that? The second question, which is very short, it just came to my mind when I thought about politics of perfection and then of imperfection. Of course, it's not a dichotomy. I do understand that, but still, how do we how would you juxtapose imperfection and queer theory? And is always imperfect? What do you think? I'm very curious.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you for wonderful questions, and thank you also for being here and of underscoring the point of really feeling that we're being together. I think I said also at the beginning of my lecture, it was just a real relief that you were organizing this. I was especially sad the first days after Natalia's death, and from the moment that I knew it would take place, there was this huge feeling of comfort. And I'm very happy that you're going to also repeat it in the coming years. It really gives this feeling, okay, I don't have to be afraid that if I'm thinking about other things, you know, this will somehow disappear. There will be a moment where we will be sitting together and we will be honoring Natasha. So that is really a big comfort. And thanks for underlining that once more, Rita. That's one. And two, please do also ask me critical questions about the protest project, because I need lots of funding. And I'm not going to get it if it's not good enough. So do ask me very difficult questions about that project. Try to be as difficult as Natasha would be. But having said that, I think in what we traditionally call high culture, things do work differently. But what I like to do in this project is try to completely ignore that and to try to look also at parallels and patterns. And with that aim in the back of my mind, I've really actually enjoyed trying to look, for instance, in opera, this genre that Natalia is also so fond about, for citations by composers, libretto writers, people who write about operas, for their remarks on imperfection. So of course, Michel van der Aa is a very specific case because he is a contemporary composer who works much with, here come the glitches again, also with, he is very familiar with glitch theory and glitch art and music, and he uses that in his work. But also in more classical operas, you sometimes come across very interesting comments by composers who say something, you know, more canonical composers who say something about how it's the imperfections in the, either in the melody or in the scene setting, which make the story more real, or comments like this. So I am actually really interested in not differentiating the framework, but at the same time, I think this is a possible approach. And what I would really love in the future, if there are other people who do offer such more differentiating frameworks. It's just not what I do. And the queer theory, I'm just going to leave it because there are more questions, but what I can say is one person in our project who has wonderful things to say about that is Fabienne Rahmadiev. She's one of the 2 PhD students. And one of her chapters is sort of fully devoted to linking, thinking about imperfection to queerness and queer theory, with special attention for Bishkek, actually. So that's a very exciting chapter of her dissertation. Thank you, Rita.
Thank you. Andrea Briganti, please.
Well, first of all, again, thank you for setting up this event. It's so beautiful that you are doing this, and because we are missing. Yeah, and thank you also for having the discussion in English. I am one of those who are making it impossible for you to have it in Russian, because probably most of you would be, you know, more at ease with your native language. But just to say that it was a wonderful experience when I visited Moscow and the Higher School of Economics, and some of you were there, and we really had a wonderful, cozy time. And also thanks, you know, to the wonderful person, Natalia, and that she really made the atmosphere and stuff. And we explored a little bit the city, and it was really an outstanding experience for me. And thank you very much, Ellen, for beautiful lecture and for really a very sophisticated reading of your topics and of your themes. And also very interesting that you're presenting the intersection between 2 research projects, and you're looking for the connecting lines. And so maybe more than a question, it's one of these lines that could be drawn between these 2 projects of yours, which was very, very, let's say, captivating for me, the role somehow of the body. Because at the beginning of your talk, you have recalled the dysmorphic body disorder, or dysmorpha, whatever you want to call it. Yes, it's this obsession with the minor flows of someone's body, face, or whatever. So which is a psychiatric condition, really. It can become very serious, and it increases very much the suicide rate in people who are affected by this. And on the other hand, your research into protests, again, somehow, okay, protests can be very, very wide, and they can be motivated by very different sets of reasons why people revolt, actually. But certainly the role of the body is there very, very fully. So again, we could say that here again, the body becomes like a kind of battlefield where somehow this seems to speak about somehow the power that we want to give to forms, and why do forms have such a powerful a resonance to our mind, to our desires? And so what is this desire for form somehow that connects the perfect, the imperfect, the old, the new, the classical, the rebelling stances? So maybe the body could be one of the topic you want to put into your new research, because we've seen, of course, it's really also about the difficulty of revolting, right? That you risk so much. So so that could be one of the things that interesting for you. Just a general comment. Sorry.
Yes. Thank you so much, Andrea, for this comment. That is very useful indeed. In the book on imperfections that I'm going, so in my own monograph, I have these chapters devoted to, for instance, imperfect lives, imperfect sounds. So there is a link also with the protest images and words. And one of the chapters is called Imperfect Bodies. So that's one actually of the first chapters that I've already written, where the body is central. But I hadn't thought about the role of the body in the new project this actively, whereas it's quite clear from what you're saying that it is quite central to the new project. I don't immediately have a response to what you're saying, but I'm going to take the comment home. And what it reminded me of, well, maybe this is nonsensical, but is one study that I still haven't read in detail, but that I've long wanted to read, which sounded really promising, is this NLO study of Soviet underwear, where the author of the study also says that underwear was sort of the battlefield where the powers of the time were actually, if you look closely at that, at photographs of underwear, the way people talk about it, you can really see that that is where ideological battles are fought out. And somehow your comment reminded me of that, and of how the body is also such a battlefield. So thank you so much. And I'll just have to take this home and think about it. I also have actually a question which nobody needs to answer straight away, but could perhaps the body be one site where, if we would integrate Eastern European protest culture studies more firmly into that transnational theorizing, would the body be one site where, this would make a difference? I don't know if I'm phrasing this correctly, but I'm really searching for ways not to just say that this will refine the field, but to think of how it will refine the field. And maybe I'll find answers in turning to the body. Thanks.
Thank you. So Alexander Tanhilevich.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, thank you indeed for the very inspiring and interesting lecture. I'd like to make just a short remark about imperfection in the Soviet Union, following probably what Lev Manovich has said. I remember the article by Yuri Shiglov about Zoshenko, actually saying that Zoshenko's world is constructed around imperfection, like literally nothing works. And maybe one of the reasons is actually what Lev spoke about, which is that, well, the world was dismantled, and in reality, many things stopped working, and that probably got reflected in literature. And there is no romanticizing of imperfection, no idealizing of imperfection in Zoshenko's work, obviously. However, in the late Soviet Union, in Pokrovsky Varota film, 1983, we find this wonderful character, Anna Adamovna, who says, "Я такая загадочная, противоречивая вся," which means I'm full of mystery and controversy, which probably resembles those ladies from the internet who say that I'm perfect imperfection, right? Anna Adamovna is obviously depicted ironically in the film. And I wonder, and maybe that's an idle question, whether we can speak about a certain turn, you know, that happens somewhere between Zoshenko and 1983, or these things simply coexisted and there is no opposition at all whatsoever in them. But of course, that's about the Soviet context. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So first of all, I hope that I will find the article that you're speaking about if I'm going to look just for Yuri Shiglov and Zoshenko, but if not, I wrote down your name, I might return to you about it because that's really useful. Thank you. And at an earlier talk about this topic, Ilya Kukulin was so kind as to point me to another work from the Oberiut context, well, sort of taken more broadly, the thing for the thinking of Harms, the same notion was very important. And he would talk about it in terms of, what was it, неравновесие с маленькой погрешностью, I think. There was this famous phrase from his work. Yeah, I see Vera Zvereva, of course, nodding. I'm sure she knows much better than me. I have it in my writing, but I don't remember off the top of my head. But there clearly is this very specific way of dealing with concepts, like in the writings of Harms, he also uses the term несовершенство to speak about this. So the word is very prominent also in talking about the ideal balance in life would be a balance where there are always some small imperfections. And the way you talk about it is indeed, I think, a way in which the imperfection is not so much romanticized, but it just plays a different role. So that's, thank you for that article. And as for the question, is there perhaps a link or a turn? Do things change between then and now? That's also something I would just need to think about longer. I had forgotten about that citation, which a friend of mine always, for fun, cites, but I didn't know it was from Покровские ворота. Я такая загадочная, противоречивая вся. But for me, your question rather makes me want to revisit my own thinking of it and think about how, on the one hand, it's of course wonderful to compare things. On the other things, there's something very different going on in the posts by Ksenia Tajna and Gertana, not in the sense that it's not high culture or that it's, you know, differences between high and pop culture, but they are speaking about behavior, life, these very large concepts. Whereas, for instance, avant-garde artists, I'm not even speaking necessarily about Zoshenko and Harms, but avant-garde artists who work with the несовершенство that Shklovsky is talking about, they are working with it more as a formal device, perhaps. So that's a different dynamics. But I just want to think a bit longer about that. So I'll take that comment home too. And these are some first rambling comments on your question. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you. So Kirill Levinson wrote me that he wanted to ask something. So please, Kirill Alexeyevich, now it's your time.
Thanks a lot. I hope you'll excuse me for speaking Russian because I've got a flu and it prevents me from thinking in English. So I hope you don't mind me saying a few words in Russian. Я, собственно, не вопрос хотел задать, а сделать два небольших замечания. Первое, это касается того значения, которое несовершенству придавалось в высокой русской, ну, такой разночинной дворянской русской культуре XIX века, как маркеру русской идентичности в противопоставлении западной, ну, прежде всего немецкой. Когда это несовершенство, там, несоблюдение расписаний русскими поездами или там обломовщина или еще что-то, восхвалялось как проявление индивидуальности, живости, каких-то внутренних, подлинно человеческих или, наоборот, духовных, религиозных достоинств русского человека в противоположность вот мертвому, механистическому, умственному, поверхностному, чистому совершенству Запада. И это как бы в принципе часть такого вот дискурса о превосходстве русского над западным, преимущественно, повторяю, таким вот промышленным, индустриальным и отчасти там научным, буржуазным, конечно, прежде всего дисциплинированным протестантским Западом. Потом это же эксплуатировалось во время Второй мировой войны как противопоставление вот этих немцев, фашистов, аккуратистов, у них орднунг, у них машины, у них все по расписанию, и уничтожение людей по расписанию, и война по расписанию, и кофе по расписанию. А мы вот такие, значит, грязные, все вручную, ничего не работает, но мы добрые, наше дело правое, мы победим, и в конце концов победили. Очень интересно мне было обнаружить эхо этого же дискурса в рассказе Бернхарда Шлинка «Обрезание», где, помните, героиня с дырками на свитере, еврейка, и ее бойфренд немец, который не может спокойно смотреть на дырявый свитер, и когда он ей на это указывает, она разворачивает целую речь про то, что вот в этом вы все немцы, значит, вам всюду нужно, чтобы все было идеально, а кто не идеальный, того вы отправляете в газовую камеру и так далее. Забавно, что вот этот дискурс русского превосходства работает совершенно иначе, когда речь идет о спорте. Когда речь идет о спорте, не восхваляется там, допустим, нарушение правил российскими спортсменами или их какая-то техническая меньшая подготовленность или еще что-то в этом роде. Тут дискурс устроен совершенно иначе. Да? Тут речь идет о соревновании по одинаковым правилам, а не значит, о превосходстве в нарушении. И последнее, что я хотел сказать, это связь между двумя темами вашего прекрасного доклада, которая, мне кажется, не безинтересной. В том дискурсе, который я наблюдаю в соцсетях, прежде всего в Фейсбуке, в русском его сегменте, я с удивлением замечаю, как восхищается российская либеральная общественность тем, насколько дисциплинированный, чистый, аккуратный белорусский протест. Как они снимают обувь, вставая на скамеечку, как они убирают за собой мусор, как они все трезвые, как они не пачкают стены, какая красивая накрашенная Маша Колесникова и так далее, и так далее. То есть вещи, которые раньше вызывали бы отторжение и стигматизировались бы как проявление вот какого-то такого не нашего, негативного, не настоящего, не аутентичного, не искреннего, тут наоборот ставится в заслугу белорусским протестантам, то есть протестующим. Да, и в добавление к подонкам еще я хотел сказать, конечно, очень важен Дмитрий Горчев, как, так сказать, глашатый вот этого вот контркультурного противопоставления, значит, вот таких несовершенных хороших, совершенно плохим. Спасибо огромное за ваш прекрасный доклад, мне очень интересно было его слушать и следить за дискуссией.
Спасибо большое. Oh, я старалась очень быстро печатать. Okay, I'll switch back to English. Many questions for those of you who do not speak Russian. I think from my answer, you will guess also what the question was about. It was in part, I hope that I'm paraphrasing it correctly, Kirill, about the this very classical historical assumption that Russia is somehow more superior or is somehow superior to the West in its imperfection. So this discourse in which imperfection becomes a marker of authenticity, moral superiority, in discussions about different places. And then you compared it, Kirill, to some more contemporary examples, right, in sports and in discussions about protests, where some of these discursive stereotypes are actually reversed. So some of the things that I was thinking about is, first of all, that is also a very important trope that I want to look at in the book, in a chapter called Imperfect Places. So there are all these little words that I'm linking to the word imperfect. And in fact, there's just a new book, I think it just came out with NLO, called Несовершенная публичная сфера. And for this book, Tatiana Weiser and I were in touch, she's one of the editors, were in touch about this concept of imperfection in the context of public sphere theory. And in the afterword of that book, I talk a little bit about some of the tropes that you're talking about. So I'm trying to think of what would be the best way to respond to this comment. So on the one hand, this is something I'm already thinking about, talking about, but you give some examples that are very interesting for me to enrich this. If people are interested, there is one really interesting source that I'm citing about these tropes, and that is a book by Dale Pessman called Russia and Soul. It's a really interesting study by an anthropologist of different rhetorical cliches that people use when they talk about Russia. And she explains that this rhetoric of, so this is again, I think also returning to your comment or question, Lev, she did these anthropological questionnaires, I think in a city in the Ural, I don't remember exactly which city, but where she says that from the answers you can see that very often people would talk about certain things as imperfections, and then they would somehow deal with these alleged imperfections by saying that they actually were a sign that their lives or their society were richer than in those places which lacked those imperfections. So this was a way of coping with hurdles in everyday life by saying that the imperfect was actually something that made life richer. So that's a book that I found really helpful in thinking about this. And what was interesting for me and new is I hadn't really thought about how this discourse, of course, returned in the Second World War in talk about Germans. In the book of which I showed you a picture, the Bloomsbury volume that's coming out, we have a really interesting chapter by Ernst van Alphen, a Dutch literary historian, who demonstrates that well, his point more or less is that messy archives can actually save lives, because the better archives were organized in the Second World War, the more people perished. It's a really interesting chapter, but to some extent, I guess that it also buys into this rhetoric itself, the chapter, if you see what I mean. So the chapter more or less confirms that in this case, I think sloppy Belgian archives actually saved people's lives, whereas the Dutch archives of Jewish citizens, which were very organized, also ensured that much more people were killed in the war. Okay, maybe I'm deviating now, but your comment actually made me think that it might be interesting to devote some special attention to talk about imperfection as a Russian dostoinstvo in the context of the Second World War and discussions about the Germans. So thanks very much for that. And sports, yes, I'm not going to go there, but thank you so much. And I also wrote down Dmitry Gorchev's name because I don't talk about him that much yet. So thank you for all of these very helpful comments. We're still talking about imperfection more than, oh, thanks very much for the comments about protest. That's really useful, I think, for the new project, because I guess in protest aesthetics in general, an aesthetic of imperfection can also serve as a marker of, you know, courage, or showing people that you are not part of the Amon, which has these very uniformed, the Amon people wear these very smooth uniforms, whereas protesters sometimes deliberately fetishize more niryaashly looks. And now, after your comment, I'm starting to think, is there, to what extent is indeed this very conspicuous talk about how the Belarusian protests are organized much more cleanly, or I don't know, more civically? How does that matter to stories about protest aesthetics? And, you know, how do people talk about protests in different countries? Okay, no, now I'm starting to ramble. Thank you very much. I'm going to take that comment home too. Very useful.
Thank you, Ellen. Tatiana Benediktova also wanted to ask something. Tatiana Dmitrievna, please.
Thank you. But I'm sorry, my question or small comment is also about imperfection.
All right.
Much impressed by your attempt to historicize this notion. And I kept thinking that it was a story of transforming a commonplace into a cult, because of course there's no common place in culture than the idea that it's human to make mistakes, and it's human to be imperfect. And if you want to any kind of even wish to be perfect is vanity and pride, because the perfection would always be this quality, this attribute of the other, whether divinity or technology or some other.
Divinity, yes, very important.
So
yeah.
I'm thinking whether it's not a kind of a strategy, transforming what had been taken to be mere fact into cult, a self-defensive strategy that might be very effective, that might, but also have some costs in certain situations. But thank you very much. It was a very interesting approach. Thank you.
Thank you. And I don't know if this answers your question, but I already talked about one of my two PhD students, Fabienne, the other, Jacob Kemper, who is also my co-editor for the Bloomsbury volume. He has actually much more than me been talking about what he calls what is his word for it? I think it's a metaphysics of imperfection. So he's also trying to look into this problem that in order to live life, you have to somehow reckon with imperfections, because life is by, this is always, he's much better at this than I am, but if life would not be imperfect, it would actually also be meaningless, because we wouldn't have anything to strive for. And he very beautifully connects that very existential condition of life, on which, you know, which is more or less built on imperfections, to discourse, first of all, about also religious discourse, historical discourse. I think that's what you were hinting at when you talked about divinity, but also to more recent theorizations by Derrida, for instance, about autoimmunity and systems that are always constantly under threat. So there is also this very metaphysical, existential dimension to the topic that I'm talking about, with which I'm a bit more, I'm doing more of the cultural historical work, whereas he really looks, I think, also into a rhetoric or aesthetics of imperfection as the sort of, what did you call it, a strategy, maybe a self-defensive strategy to cope with life. I'm not sure if that was the direction in which you were going, but it made me think of his work. And actually in the book by Bloomsbury, he's talking about this too in his chapter in that book. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. So Elizaveta Lysenko, please, and probably it will be something about the protest culture.
Yes, thank you a lot. Yes, of course, my questions, they are about protest culture, because I'm a Belarusian myself, and I spent all the 2020 in Belarus. And so the first question is actually clarifying. I would like to ask you, do you plan to compare, maybe I missed this in your presentation, do you plan to compare aesthetic objects from 2010s and 2020s and objects from the beginning of the last century cross-regionally or from the same region? Because I've been approaching the topic of Belarusian protest songs, and I've come across the fact that there are almost no new Belarusian protest songs, and part of their aesthetic appeal is based on the fact that they belong to the past and to the 1920s also. And I was interested if this part is, I'm sorry, if this past plays a significant role not only in Belarusian culture, but also, for example, in Netherlands culture of the protest of 2010s, German culture, and so on, not only Eastern Europe. And the second question, do you plan to scrutinize the state aesthetics? Because, for example, if we speak of soundscapes of protest, we cannot exclude songs which state used to silence the protesters, not only the songs of protest, but the opposite side. And I suppose that there is a very specific state aesthetics which actually influences forms of protest art objects. And do you plan to touch this topic, or do you like do you focus on protest itself and putting the state aesthetics aside? Thank you.
Thank you so much for these questions. And I would actually really like to stay in touch, if that's okay with you after today, because I don't know that many people working on Belarusian protests in particular. There are some, but the group of people whom I know are working on that so far is very small. So thanks for these wonderful questions. And then the first, do you plan to compare aesthetic objects? Yes, we indeed plan to compare objects from the 1910s, 1920s to objects from the 2010s and early 2020s, cross-regionally. And because that's a lot, this is also immediately a short answer to your second question. I would really like to look into state aesthetics, and I did notice that I can't help collecting some examples that might be interesting in talking about that. But because we are already doing so much, I'm trying to keep that a bit outside of the, well, at least the main argument. What we're trying to do so far, and I'm curious if you or others, what you would think about this, is I'm trying to lean on recent research, for instance, by, I think, Skandri, a book, one of the books in the slide that I was showing, who say that, in fact, if you want to look at both those periods, it makes perfect sense to take Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine together because of these very clear intersections, and also for the avant-garde period, because artists like, for instance, Malevich, whom we now see as Russian, is in fact just as Ukrainian as he is Russian. And there are also links with Belarus, which one could very clearly make. This is what we want to do, and the way we are trying to also defend our choice so far by saying, you know, technically we need to speak about Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, because these are three different states. And of course, we recognize that they are different states. We're not trying to say they shouldn't be, but in practice, they are very clearly interconnected in so many ways that it makes sense to do this. I'm glad that you're not, but if you have any, you know, if you or others have suggestions to fine tune that, that's also very welcome. And about the protest songs, yeah, that's especially what I would like to, if you have anything written on what you were just saying, I would really like to look into that, because I don't know that much about it yet. What I do know, or the way I'm going to find out more, is through Ingvar Steenholt. Some of you here will know him. He is a scholar from Tromsø, cultural and music, also punk rock historian of Russian punk and rock, and he is currently working on a new project on Belarusian, I think Belarusian protest music, and he will be based in Amsterdam next year. So he will be our guest in part to be jointly thinking about protest music, specifically from Belarus. But I would gladly, I simply don't know about this link with history that you're talking about. Yeah, one other thesis that I was trying to think about while you were asking your question is, could it be, if you would compare protest cultures, for instance, in the Netherlands and Belarus, which are so different in many, well, maybe I shouldn't take the Netherlands because it's very different, but if you would compare recent protests in Belarus to another country, which is not in Eastern Europe, could it be that in Belarus, historical imagery plays a more active role there in the protest than in some other places? So we found, for instance, very interesting images that were circulating online of a Malevich painting, no, not Malevich, a Chagall painting of two lovers flying above the city, and one of the two lovers was replaced by an Amon officer who was carrying a woman with him. I think it was a very popular image. And then we saw one of the images that I was just showing you of the Rodina Mать Zavet, which was reappropriated for the protest. I wondered if there is more of that, perhaps in the recent protests in Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine, than you would see in some other places. But I'd be really curious to, maybe also in the chat, it's fine, you don't need to all speak up, but if people say yes or no, that would be, I would gladly hear. Oh, and I see a question, when will the new book come, Yekaterina Kulinicheva? I'm afraid it will take very long. I'm swamped in admin matters. But it will come to life at some point. Yes, Elisaveta, you were responding, right?
It was just a quick response. Just yes, it is. There are lots of different historical references and cultural historical references in protest art in Belarus, and I think that in Russia also, but I don't know if it's difficult to compare because I'm not familiar with other protest cultures. I'm not sure if it is a special feature of Eastern European protest and Eastern European protest art, or is it like general for protesters use the historical symbolics to communicate their needs and to communicate.
Yeah, we have some good scholars in protest aesthetics in Amsterdam, so maybe I should talk to them and ask them about it. But this is an interesting question that your question triggered for me. Yeah.
We have 4 questions in the chat. Alexander Rusanov and Alexandra Kulpina asked me to read their questions, but firstly, I want to give word to Andrei Kazaredov, who also wrote some 2 questions in the chat, but he wanted to ask you in this way, in person.
And then I'll try to answer briefly. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, maybe I actually, well, first of all, thank you for an amazing lecture. And I actually have 2 questions, but I understand they actually relate to a huge range of topics. So that's why I'm going to focus on only one question regarding the neoliberal society, as some people claim we are living in. And some people also say that in this kind of society, people perpetually, it's a basic thing that people perpetually represent their self-perfectioning, and even by recognizing their weaknesses and their faults, for example, in public sphere or in social media, for example, talking about their therapy and so on, they show that they are accumulating, they are getting better, and in this regard they are trying to reach this perfection. And on the other hand, we have a range of things which is related, I think, to at some extent to the queer theory, where we have a number of people who are like regard themselves as marginalized, and at this regard they are not perfection, and they try to fight for the rights. And we may talk not only about queer people, but like also about this intersectional scale where our people are considered by the lines of oppression, and in this sense it seems that they are fighting against any perfection because they are not perfect. And I wanted to ask you, what do you actually think about it, about representing perpetual self-perfectioning and on one hand, and on the other hand, people who are trying to like destroy the perfection itself? Is it like an utopian project, or this may be possible only in a parallel ontology or something like this?
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much. I think it's an important question for a very Natasha-esque. Somehow it's bringing that Natasha to mind. One of my PhD students, Jacco Kemper, is writing about they're both writing about the link with neoliberal reasoning. And Jacco, if I remember, is using theorizing on optimalization and frictionlessness as traits of neoliberal reasoning, and counter reasoning in which the imperfect, the friction, the conflict to which those concepts are more central. As for queer theory, what I can, maybe it's not a direct answer to your question, but what I found a really inspiring study is Brilliant Imperfection by Elie Claire, a scholar in disability studies, disability theorist, who tries to explain that in also actually neoliberal societies, in ableist societies, we tend to see health as something self-evident and disabilities as a problem that need to be overcome or that need to be healed. And he votes for he also votes please for a valorization of imperfection as a response to that tendency. And the reason that I'm thinking of Natalia is, I think what I've always really appreciated, it's hard to put this into words, that I once again it feels like Natasha would have done a much better job at explaining this herself than I can. But Natalia has always felt to me as someone who was much too chic to actually really talk about neoliberal society in super anti terms, or to be only to be someone who could be pinned down only to queer theory, for instance. But at the same time, she is very clearly someone who somehow embodies a logic for me that is not about optimalization, but about very different values. And I've always really appreciated that in my contact with her. I don't know if it's hard to say this in such a way that it does what it should do to Natalia, but these values that Natalia for me embodied, which were so emphatically not about optimalization, but which were also not anti. She was just always very professional and very, I think деловой is a good Russian word, sort of going straight through all the hurdles and the problems. So in that sense, your question really reminds me of her. I don't know if this if this answers your question, but in any case, the short summary is it makes sense to think of it in these terms. And I think that queer theory and neoliberal reasoning, it's not literally an antithesis, but there is an interconnection between them, which is very interesting to explore in this context.
Yeah, to continue this topic, I would read the question of Alexander Rusanov. Can you specify how do various dreams of imperfection that you've described correlate not only with the technologies, but with the very ideas, ethical, philosophical, of authenticity, of cultural heritage, music, etc., of different periods of their age? Because I can add something that, and probably we discussed it earlier, that in contemporary British and not only British popular music, with all these retro movements and etc., the technological imperfections, I mean some kind of crackling, noise, scratching, and so on, is very important indicators of and ways of achieving the authenticity. So, technological imperfections as the representation, the mark of authenticity.
Maybe just one short answer to that question is that I look into that a little bit in my study of sincerity, which will actually, we're talking about the pictures for the Russian edition as we speak. Normally it's not here, but I was working on it this week for a class. So this is the older book. And in that book, Sincerity After Communism, I talk a bit about discussions in pop music, but also in literary writing and in other genres where musicians, but also their critics, writers, their critics, visual artists, filmmakers, where they speak of cracks, glitches, typos, and related terms as signs of, and then you can fill in the concept, either authenticity or realness or humanness in discussions about postmodernism. This is very important too, or sincerity. And one thing that I tried to show in this book is that my impression was, I'm still interested to see if maybe at some point somebody will dispute that, that's fine. But my impression was that in Russophone discussions of this type, the word искренность is used more often than, for instance, in Anglophone discussions. So that's just one relatively detailed answer to your question. But it's what I have found interesting is that across different languages, the types of concepts that are being used sometimes differ. And in Anglophone contexts, indeed, this word authenticity is extremely prominent, which in Russian, of course, is more difficult to use because will you use подлинность, which has a different history, etymological history than the term authenticity, or autentičnost, which is very specific and much newer than подлинность. So this complicates matters a bit. I hope that this is some answer to the question.
Yeah, thank you, Ellen. And one more question from Alexandra Kulpina. Very interesting question, actually. Could you specify, please, how does a person usually feel or know that something is imperfect or perfect? In the other words, where is the border between the perfect and the imperfect? And the most, it is the most interesting question, yeah. And do you know any examples of the transition from imperfect to perfect, when an object does not change its qualities, but the audience changes its opinion somehow?
Very interesting. Yeah, we were talking about this last year with colleagues in when I had a colleague last year at a research institute where I was working on my book, and he was a physicist, and he was trying to show me, Maarten Kleinhans is his name. He was trying to say, couldn't we somehow statistically prove with digital tools that certain words or certain ways to typify people were at some point described as imperfect, and then with time this shifted and then it was seen as perfect. In music history, for instance, there are certain successions of notes, I think, which used to be seen as perfectly harmonious, but at some point in music criticism they started to be described as dissonant, or people started using other terms which refer more to the sphere of the imperfect, you could say. I decided at some point that to do that statistically is just in a project where I'm already trying to do so much is not something that I'm gonna do, but it could be really interesting to do that. And maybe, I'm trying to think out loud now, maybe one place where it's interesting to see the vector shift is in advertising related to female beauty, because at some point, one very interesting case study is, for instance, the Dove campaign for real beauty, which I think was launched in around 2010, if I remember correctly. And then I think one of the slogans was "Love your imperfections." And this slogan was then used after this. It was sort of discovered by ads, by PR people. It was used by Esprit clothing brand and in other places. And in these ads, the word imperfect was meant as a sort of something to stimulate people, but at the same time, it of course stigmatized bodies that were more curvy than, size 36, people with red hair rather than blonde hair. And that marker, to use that word imperfect, somehow became so, people started problematizing it so actively that it has now disappeared from, well, not entirely, but it's used much less often. And what you now see is that, at least in the Netherlands, I see this around me in the city, more posters are used where you see models with different sizes, but without usage of the word. So it's not that you see ad makers suddenly using the word perfect, but they dropped the marker imperfect in response to public complaints. And now they just show visuals which are more inclusive than they used to be. Maybe this is one example of practices where you can see how time does something to the way the word imperfect is used.
Erin, once again, thank you very much for this brilliant talk, for this brilliant lecture and discussion with really interesting questions and really interesting answers. Yeah, applause. And it was really nice to see all of you today. And I think, I really think Natalia Samutina would love this discussion. I think it's very of our research center style.
Thank you so much. And can I maybe say in conclusion that I don't know if I made this clear also at the end of my talk, but what I tried to say is what I really hope is that with this discussion also, I'm going to take your comments home. I'm going to use them in my work. I'm sort of hope to Natashify my work more. And I really hope that this lecture series will serve for us to do that in other research projects as well. I think Natasha's thinking is, as I said at the beginning, it's just so refreshingly idiosyncratic that it would be fantastic if we can keep it alive as much as we can, together with our memories of the wonderful person that Natasha was. Thank you so much. But Natasha is, I like this usage of the also Alexei and Boris in your introductions, the present tense.